welcome to the second season of the Ecologies of Danger podcast. Ecologies of Danger is a project produced by the students of a course on environmental security at Colgate University. In this season, we look at the different ways in which the environment has become a security issue. In this episode, Needham shows how Hurricane Maria has sparked a rush of disaster profiteering in Puerto Rico.
We are dying here. And I cannot fathom the thought that the greatest nation in the world cannot figure out logistics for a small island
fast enough.
We don't get the food and the water into people's hands. What we are going to see is something close to a genocide.
That was San Juan Mayor Carmen Julian Cruz explaining the devastation of Hurricane Maria. On September 20th of last year, Maria, a Category 4 storm, made landfall on the island of Puerto Rico. The island took over 6 months to switch from relief to recovery mode. Even this week, over 200 days later, 50,000 people are still without power. How could such a disaster happen in the United States? To understand the situation, we need to go back in time to the root of the issues. The destruction was not due to the natural power of the storm. It was due to the lack of power that Puerto Rico has. This stems from colonial legacies, legal constraints, economic hardship, and a federal government that just doesn't care. The U.S. gained control of Puerto Rico as a colony in 1898 and eventually gave Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship in 1917. Yes, let me repeat that. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. This citizenship allows Puerto Ricans to freely travel within the U.S., but they are still not given the same rights as other Americans. Puerto Rico was recognized as a territory at first and gained Commonwealth status in 1952. What does this mean? In short, Puerto Rico is not a state. The federal government can step in to manage the island's affairs at any time, and the only voice they have in Congress is a non-voting member. This makes it difficult for the island to gain attention, and also funding when they need it most. While Puerto Rican citizens were given the right to manage local affairs, they lack the rights that states have. They are not allowed to vote for the president, yet rely on the executive branch for so many things. This legal reality makes it harder for Puerto Rico to not only control the island, but also to prepare for and recover from a disaster. The legal status of the island was not the only barrier, however, as the economy was in shambles long before Hurricane Maria struck. The economy boomed under U.S. control at first, thanks to a legal code that encouraged companies to relocate to the island. Companies did not have to pay taxes for 10 years, which meant that little funding was funneled into the government. Companies made a profit while social services dwindled. The agriculture industry declined as Puerto Ricans moved to urban cities in search of jobs. This rapid migration led to many people living in shanty homes that were poorly constructed. Many Puerto Ricans did find employment, but mainly in low-skilled jobs. After the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed, Puerto Rico lost its competitive advantage. Companies were drawn to Mexico with the lure of even lower wages, and companies started to leave the island. Once the tax breaks were fully removed in 2006, the remaining companies also left. Unemployment soared, and many moved off the island in search of jobs. The recession of 2008 only prolonged this suffering. Poverty rates skyrocketed and remain high even to this day, with rates about 4 times higher than the mainland U.S. The government went into a deep hole of debt, valued at over $70 billion. Without the status of a state, they're unable to declare bankruptcy to deal with this debt. In response, the U.S. Congress passed the PROMESA Act. This law gave fiscal control over Puerto Rico to an appointed board, almost a form of neocolonialism. The board attempted to reduce debt through austerity measures. This meant wage cuts, school closings, a lack of social services, and disinvestment in infrastructure. While this was supposed to reduce the debt, it only made Puerto Ricans more vulnerable. How could this have been passed? Luis Jose Valentin, a Puerto Rican journalist, explains.
First of all, you have to remember that the whole PROMESA law was established because Puerto Rico is a territory. If Puerto Rico were a state or Puerto Rico were independent, you would not have any kind of power in Congress to enact such a law.
So, the legal standing of Puerto Rico is tied to the economic issues that the island faces. The vulnerability of Puerto Rico to Maria stemmed from the austerity measures. Just 1 year prior to Maria, a fire wiped out the entire electric grid of the island. This was due to a lack of maintenance and funding. No surprise there. The lack of electricity after Maria, then, should not be viewed as surprising. What was different was how slow the federal government's response was. The U.S. Navy didn't even deploy their hospital ship until 6 days after the storm hit. Even without Hurricane Maria, the island was struggling under the PROMESA Act, and there were many people protesting it. But after the storm, some key lessons were learned. The status quo in Puerto Rico is not good enough. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, did create a plan for Puerto Rico in 2014 in the event of a Category 4 hurricane. What this plan failed to note, though, was just how inadequate Puerto Rican government and social services were. FEMA usually relies mainly on local services and infrastructure and acts as an additional aid giver. With Maria, however, Puerto Rico was just barely scraping by. FEMA was unprepared to be assisting to the extent that they needed to, but this should have been realized long before Maria. When Maria did make landfall, the government scrambled to provide aid. The contract to repair the electric grid was awarded to the Whitefish Montana Company, with only 2 employees and 2 years of experience. Why were they chosen? The governor of Puerto Rico said they were the only company to not require a down payment, something the debt-ridden island couldn't even afford. Puerto Ricans found themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place in almost every aspect of life. This emphasis on debt hindered Puerto Rico in recovery. As President Trump stated,
to tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget a little out of whack because we've spent a lot of money on Puerto Rico.
Instead of focusing on aid and people, the president emphasized how important Puerto Rican debt was. Kishla, a Puerto Rican resident, echoed this.
Everybody in here in the community thinks that they forgot about us.
Another way Puerto Ricans were forgotten about was due to the Jones Act. The Jones Act limited the ability of foreign aid to reach the island. This outdated law mandates that shipping between U.S. ports, like Puerto Rico, need to be on U.S. ships. After some pressure, President Trump did lift the law, but only for 10 days. The aid that did arrive sat in shipping containers for weeks at the ports. Roads were impassable as Puerto Rico didn't have the services to transport the aid around. Is there any hope after the storm? Congress did approve $16 billion for Puerto Rico to recover, but it's estimated that over $90 billion is needed. And unless PROMESA and the legal structure of Puerto Rico is changed, it's likely this disaster will happen again. As Kishla puts bluntly,
It's not the storm, it's what happened next, you know what I mean? And it's really difficult, really difficult.
For Colgate University, I'm Reve Needham.